Today is February 6, 2025. I'm Dr. Claudia Kramer, the Probasco Chair, Free Enterprise, and Professor of Economics at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga, and this is the Probasco Podcast. I am joined today by two special guests, both economics professors at West Virginia University, my alma mater, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves and then give us an understanding of what's first sparked their interest in economics.
Thank you, Claudia. I'm Jane Ruseski. I am a professor of economics at West Virginia University. My interest in economics was sparked when I was an undergraduate. I was a health policy and management major and took some economics classes as electives. And by the time I was through intermediate micro, I decided that I thought economics was very interesting. I also decided along the way that I wanted to get a PhD. My career goal was to be CEO of a hospital, but partway through my undergraduate education, I decided that I wanted to get a PhD, and I was deciding what discipline to get it in, and I was toying with political science and economics, and decided to go with economics, and always knew that I would have a focus in health economics, and so that's what sparked my interest in economics and why I went on to get a PhD.
And where did you go to undergrad?
University of New Hampshire.
Okay, New Hampshire. And then where did you do your PhD?
Johns Hopkins University.
Okay. All right, now over to our other guest.
Hi, I'm Brad Humphreys, and I am Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and Research in the John Chambers College of Business and Economics at West Virginia University, and I'm also a professor of economics there in the economics department.
And what sparked your interest in economics?
Well, I did my undergraduate work at West Virginia University, where I now work, and it wasn't my first undergraduate degree. I got an undergraduate degree in what was then called management science, which we would call management information systems now. It was a coding degree where you learned COBOL, to date myself. Yeah. And as part of that, I started to I took a couple of upper-level electives in economics, labor economics in particular, and I really found that much more interesting than the COBOL coding I was doing in my management science degree program. And at that time, West Virginia had a program where in the college, if you had one bachelor's degree in business administration, in 1 year you could get a second degree in economics.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, undergraduate degree. And so, I decided to postpone the process of getting on with life and stick around and take another year worth of courses so that I could get the BS in economics. And then I found out that I was really interested in a lot of different economic concepts and just how it let me understand what was going on in the world. And I was doing pretty well in my classes, and one of my professors said, you're pretty good at this. Have you thought about going to graduate school? And I had not. No. And we talked a bit about graduate education in economics, and I decided that would be a great way to postpone still going out into the labor force. So I enrolled and went into the PhD program at Johns Hopkins at that time. But it was really that second, when your whole life is about coding,
yeah,
and then economics is really practical, but still helps you to understand what's going on. I just found that really powerful.
That's fantastic. Similar experience. Just it was introduced to the discipline and thought this is great, and I'll just study this the rest of my life. And that's basically what I've done. So I've never left school, and I'm completely fine with that.
I tell people the same thing. I went directly from undergraduate school to graduate school, and I've never really. I entered West Virginia University in the fall of 1981, and I've really never left academia since then.
Yeah, similar experience. Okay, so Brad, you consider yourself a sports economist, which a lot of times people don't put economics and sports together. So can you just give us an understanding of how those two fields go together, and then how you specifically, or when you got into sports econ?
Well, that's an interesting story. Okay. I was trained as a macroeconomist.
Oh, yeah, that's really interesting.
And my dissertation was on the behavior of manufacturers' inventories over the business cycle.
Okay.
which is actually that's a really important propagation mechanism for how GDP declines during recessions. For example, firms start to build up inventories of in manufacturing of their finished goods and don't sell them, and then that's part of GDP, so that contributes.
Makes sense.
I graduated and got my first job, and I was hired as a macroeconomist, an academic job, and my research was all about business cycles. And I started out as an academic in the very middle of what macroeconomists now call the Great Moderation.
Oh, yeah.
So there were basically no recessions, and it was very difficult for me to publish papers on business cycles in journals because they were no longer interested in it. Everybody's working on growth, and everybody's like, "Well, there aren't any business cycles anymore. There's no
we
recessions.
fixed it,
Yeah, we
right?
fixed that. We're not interested in this." And there I am, 3 years into my first academic job, and basically, I realized I had to find a new line of research. Nobody trains to be a sports economist, right?
Yeah, not really.
And at that time, the city of Baltimore had stolen the Cleveland Browns from Cleveland, and they moved to Baltimore. They built them a new stadium, and that became the Ravens. And as part of the stadium was 100% publicly financed, $600 million, taxpayer money.
What year was this?
It was
Years?
1996.
Okay.
Yeah, it was the mid-90s.
Okay.
And along with that came an economic impact study that claimed that playing 10 football games a year in Baltimore would generate 30,000 jobs and raise earnings by hundreds of millions of dollars per year. And I thought to myself, that can't be right. I mean, it's 8 at that time, 8 or maybe 9 with the preseason game, football games.
Right.
And you're just not going to get that kind of economic benefit out of that. And I went and looked at the literature, and it wasn't very good at that point in the 90s. And put together my longtime collaborator, Dennis Coates, and I wrote a paper. And I thought that would be it, right? I thought, well, yeah, this is a one-off
I'm done.
thing.
I answered it, right?
Yeah, I answered the question. But, these things don't happen, and I'll go back to not being able to publish business cycle research. But it turns out there's one of these new stadium deals going on somewhere in the country all the time. And then I started getting interested in sports economics research because of the great data that is available in sports. So the issue with being a macroeconomist is everybody's working the same data set, right? You've got like annual GDP, or maybe you have quarterly GDP by state or something like that. But if you're not an amazing econometrician, it's really hard to make contributions. And here in sports, I came to find out there's tons of great data that nobody was working with at that time. And I'm consider myself an empirical economist. And the sports data is just so amenable to so many research topics in economics that it just took off from there.
Yeah.
And I started publishing papers on competitive balance in sports leagues and salaries of male and female college basketball coaches, and never looked back.
That's fantastic. All right, so going back then to Jane, so it sounded like different from Brad. You knew you were interested in healthcare, and so decided to go into grad school in econ, but always knew that you were going to do health economics. And so what was some of your kind of first papers, dissertation, like what were your real interests in?
Sure. So I now consider myself both a health and sports economist, where my work there is at the intersection. But my first work was in industrial organization. So my dissertation was about dynamic non-price competition in the hospital industry.
Okay.
So at that time, there was this tension in the literature about whether or not like certificate of need programs and regulation that limits supply of hospitals and the things they can provide was good or bad for competition. And I wanted to look at that literature and make a contribution there that would be a little bit stronger than what was there. And so that's what my dissertation was about. And I was able to make a contribution there because at the time, I was working at the Maryland Health Services Cost Review Commission, which is a commission that regulates hospital rates in Maryland. It's the only state in the country that does this. It has they have a waiver from Medicare payment policies, and it's an all-payer system, and the state sets the rates that hospitals get paid. And I was working at that commission as deputy director of research and methodology, and I had access to very good data where I could actually construct a price of capital measure, which was missing from a lot of this research. And so that's where I worked in for a while. I don't really do as much work in IO anymore because the IO has advanced beyond me, and then the methods there are a little bit beyond me. So my work now is more in the area of healthy and unhealthy behaviors.
Okay.
Trying to understand why people engage or don't engage in risky health behaviors like smoking, or healthy behaviors like good eating and physical activity. So a lot of my work is in that area now.
So what are some of your findings that's coming out of that in terms of why is it that some people still smoke, even though it seems like people understand the cost associated?
Yes, well, that's a good question.
Yeah.
We don't know the answer to that question, but I think the not from an economic standpoint, but from a biological standpoint, it's just very addictive. And so trying to get people to quit and to stay off cigarettes is very challenging. But still, I have a paper that I wrote with Brad, actually, trying to understand why the maternal smoking rate in West Virginia and Appalachia is so high. It's remarkably high, and we came up with a few mechanisms that we couldn't really test with our data, but one of the mechanisms we think might be at play here, and we were able to demonstrate a little bit, is that it's networking and social pressures, and we found that mothers who smoked, or the rates of maternal smoking would be different across different time cohorts. Like in earlier cohorts of mothers, when informational campaigns were really out there, they were less likely to smoke than women in later cohorts where these informational campaigns aren't so strong anymore.
Interesting.
And it could be, my mother smoked. It's in the culture. It's just cultural. So that's one interesting paper that I have. Another interesting recent paper looks at the impact of building professional sports stadiums on infant health.
Okay.
And
interesting connection here.
And so we find that the headline result there is that women who have babies that were born in a county when a stadium was being constructed have lower birth weight babies than mothers who gave birth to a baby in a city where there was no construction or no professional sports team. And the mechanism there is air pollution.
Oh.
Because the first thing that's happening is a big pile of big holes being dug.
Yeah.
The first thing
Lots
you
of
do.
trucks are going in, emits a lot of particulate 2.5 matter that gets right into your body, into the placenta, and affects the growth of the baby.
Wow. That is so. I'm assuming there's connections or papers that had been done with just pollution and birth weights.
Yes.
And so
Yes.
this is then connecting the more of a cause of pollution in this specific event.
Yes.
That's fascinating.
Well, there's a really interesting paper on infant birth weights that exploits the introduction of easy pass lanes in on the New Jersey Turnpike.
Yeah.
So they looked at birth weights of infants whose mothers lived close to those toll booths. And so before Easy Pass was introduced, huge numbers of cars were sitting there idling, waiting to pay the toll. Now Easy Pass comes along at a very specific point in time, and all of a sudden all the traffic is just flying through there. And that increased the birth weight of infants because it was just the car exhaust, and it was very spatially close. You know, you had to live within 3/4 of a mile of one of those toll booths.
That's fascinating. That is such an interesting connection between health and sports economics. That is just, that's blowing my mind. So something you mentioned, the culture in Appalachia. So I am a native West Virginian, and most of my research is in development, and I look at how culture affects development. So once I got a little bit older, I started thinking, I think probably how I grew up influenced both my research interests in terms of understanding what causes wealth, what causes disparities in wealth. So I grew up on the Ohio River, could see Ohio, and there's where all the businesses were. They weren't in West Virginia. And then I also was interested in how much is this a cultural explanation. So I'll turn back to you, Brad, because you also are from West Virginia. So what is have you thought back on growing up, your experiences, how that's kind of shaped your interest or just path in terms of ending up as an economics professor?
Yeah, so I grew up in a very small town in West Virginia, 1,200 people,
Okay.
one stoplight. There was no economics taught in the high school curriculum there. It gives me some insight into the struggles that Appalachians face. Are we in Appalachia here? I think we are. Aren't we?
Technically, I think
Technically,
so.
one of the counties.
We're right
Yeah.
at the border. Mm-hmm.
And my hometown where I grew up was basically unchanged from, I don't know, before the Civil War until when I was there, and the population was about the same, and it was a largely agrarian.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't grow up in the part of West Virginia where there are coal mines.
Mm-hmm. I didn't either.
Yeah. So it has. It's shaped my research in that I have worked on non-sports projects like this one with Jane, or we have another paper about what the impact of getting city water and sewage was on health outcomes in Appalachia, because I want to give back and I want to do what I can to try to improve the lives of West Virginians and Appalachians. And I thought, we have a paper I think it's pretty good. I think the title's clever. It's called Out of the Outhouse.
Oh, that's great.
And we actually use census data back into the 50s and 60s when a huge number of Appalachians reported not having running water.
That's not. I remember visiting family on my dad's side that they did not have running water and they had an outhouse. So that wasn't that long ago.
No.
And that's what is probably shocking to a lot of people that are not from that area, that, a generation or two ago is really all we're talking about here, that it was still, maybe not it was still the minority of people, but it was still relatively common enough that you could visit family and that would be their experience.
Yeah, which is, to think about it here in 2025 is pretty shocking.
It is, but I think that there's still people that are living that way. And some of it might be by choice, in the sense of that's given all of their preferences still where they want to be, right? They don't want to necessarily have to move or things like that. But that's, I think that's fascinating in terms of thinking about how to connect your current research and giving back and trying to understand some of these, kind of economic disparities that still exist. And so, Jane, you are not from West Virginia.
I am not.
We forgive you. But so tell us a little bit about where you are from and if you think that upbringing and just things that you experienced growing up shaped your interest in health, for example.
Yeah, sure. I can speak to the health because that's more relevant, considering I didn't think I was going to be a PhD economics person as a child. I grew up in Fairfield, Connecticut, which is a suburban town that's quite wealthy. About an hour north of New York City, so very much a bedroom commuting community to New York City. However, even though the town I lived in is very wealthy, we were not. I come from a large family. My father was a doctor. I think that had some influence on shaping my interests in the health area. I volunteered as a candy striper as a kid, and so I think that also helped to shape that. So for some reason, that just had always been something I thought I wanted to do. But again, not from, I thought about as a child becoming a doctor, and I basically thought I wouldn't be able to get into medical school. So I ditched that idea, but I knew I wanted to do something around the health area. And again, going in and being a health management policy major with the full anticipation of being a CEO of a hospital is where I thought I was going. So I think that ambition did shape my earlier research agenda, and when I talked about what my dissertation was about. But I also didn't have I was not an academic to start with. I worked at the Health Services Cost Review Commission for 8 years and finished my PhD while working there. And then I went to the Federal Trade Commission for 5 years and was a staff economist there.
Okay.
So that, that's where a lot of the industrial organization and competition work and all that, that research agenda stems from. But then when I did become an academic, that was at University of Illinois, and we were my department was in the College of Applied Health Sciences, and I was trying to think of a research agenda that would fit with the mission of the college, and that's when Brad and I started doing some work on participation in physical activity.
Okay.
So there's a large literature there in the non-economics world, but there was very little on what are the economic aspects, economic determinants of why people would be physically active. And that's where that research agenda started, and it's just really bloomed from there to include not just physical activity, but other health behaviors and studying other aspects of physical activity, like the impact of being a regular exerciser on health outcomes. And then that research agenda just continued to blossom when moving to West Virginia 11 years ago, because of what we've been talking about the extreme disparities and the poor health outcomes that West Virginia experiences along most of the measures. And I really am interested and continue to work in help in trying to understand these health disparities and what's causing them, or how you can figure out what's causing them. That's what we don't know, and I think that kind of work is still going to be very important. And it's not just Appalachia. These health disparities are everywhere, and they're regardless of how strong a country's healthcare system is. So getting to it is a challenge, and just keeps things interesting.
Yeah, it's fascinating work, and it's as direct real world applications. So that's incredibly interesting. So Valentine's Day is coming up, and you guys are an econ love story. And so you've both mentioned that you did your PhDs at Johns Hopkins. So I'm assuming that's where you met.
Yes.
That's correct.
Okay. So who wants to give me the scoop on that?
Well, Jane was a year ahead of me, actually.
Yes, I was.
You know how graduate education is in economics. It's and the Hopkins economics department was pretty small.
Okay.
Probably like the size of WVU's, like 10 per year cohorts. And you know how difficult it is adjusting to what graduate education in economics is like. And that made, and I think we had some very, very close cohorts. And I don't know, one thing led to another. And we've been married 35 years. So
congratulations. That's really fascinating.
We were friends because the cohorts around us, we were very close. Years 1 through 4 were hanging out with each other, going to dinner with junior faculty on a regular basis. So even though we weren't in the same coursework, we were in the same lounge area studying and things like that. And we just one thing, we were friends.
We were friends for a long time.
That's great.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So do you guys talk about economics all the time?
Yeah.
Because it applies to everything. So we're always doing right. Yeah. Well, that's fun. So what would be some advice that you have? You both have, you both work with PhD students at West Virginia University. Jane, you are the PhD coordinator there, and Brad, you've served on these committees as well. And so what advice do you have for PhD students right now in economics?
Just general advice?
Sure.
Are we still on Valentine's Day? Or is this...
Yeah, date or not date, or...
Well, Jane and I are always discouraging students from doing what we did, but it doesn't work.
Right. Yeah. You love who you love, I guess.
That's right.
The way it works out.
Some students who are couples, and it's if I tell them that Brad and I, you have to be prepared to be flexible, and you have to be prepared to move, because solving the two-body problem is very challenging. You might need to contemplate the possibility of living apart until you can land those two jobs that are going to be within a reasonable commuting distance for both of you. Brad and I were, I think, fortunate in the way our lives progressed, because was a non-academic for 14 years before going into academics, and that gave us separation in rank. And so that made it easier for us to get 2 jobs in
that's
the same
interesting.
place because he was an associate professor and I would be coming in as an assistant, so that was helpful for us. But we didn't know it would work out that way. It just did. But we did move a lot. So
Yeah.
We moved almost literally to the end of the earth, Edmonton, Alberta, Canada,
Wow.
in order to get a situation, a job, 2 jobs in the same department.
Did you live apart? Did you ever live?
We never lived apart.
Yeah, that'd be tough. But you're right. Those are the trade-offs you got to start making when you both, especially if you both want to be in academia.
That's right. I think it's substantially easier if one part of the couple is willing to work outside academia.
Yeah. So moving away from the love life for their PhD students, what advice do you have in terms of field or topics, or how is it that to be successful? What do you see coming down the pipeline in terms of economics right now?
Well, we don't have a crystal ball, but I think we always harp on our students to network, as much as possible, to go to conferences and maybe even, maybe you might have to pay a little out of pocket if you can to go to conferences and present your work and network. We encourage them to, after they get through the core coursework and are starting, their field classes, to start thinking about research and start writing papers. Because for our students coming out of West Virginia, having a couple of publications is helpful on the job market. But we really do really focus on getting some research going, networking. They get very good teaching experience, so that's really helpful. And also, we encourage them not to be too geographically picky when it comes to their first job, and to apply widely, so something lands. Yeah.
That's great advice. That was advice that I got from the PhD program at West Virginia, and I've moved around a bit too. But yes, that's great. In terms of just research topics, or what is just some of the advice that you have, or is it more of just?
Oh, I have advice.
Okay. Let's hear it, Brad.
My advice on research topics is to pick a research topic that you're passionate about, because we all know that the process of doing research and the publication process is difficult. And if you're starting on something just because you think that it's going to be sexy for a journal, when the going gets tough and you're really struggling, when we know that it's going to come to that, you might not have the passion about that project, and then that's going to turn into a dry hole. So I always tell my students to start with something that you have an identifiable reason to be passionate about.
That's great. Yeah, I think that's
the other advice that we give the students about starting research. It's hard to come up with research questions that are manageable, and find that at first students are inclined to want to solve the world's problems with one paper, and we cannot do that. So I encourage them to, yes, think broadly at first, but then try and narrow down what you're looking at, because it's a marginal process. We're not making big new discoveries every day. We're moving a literature along by making some marginal contributions, and that's okay.
Yeah, and students, young researchers have a problem grasping that idea. That if I can just show that this result holds in a different data set that's already been extensively analyzed, that's a contribution, and you can publish that paper. But they want to say, no, I want to solve all the problems in this area.
in this one paper.
Yeah, in this one paper. And
Yeah.
that's a recipe for failure.
Yeah,
because
that's not going to go over well.
you're never going to finish that paper.
You're never going to finish it. Yeah. So you maybe have already touched on it, but can you, looking back on your career at this point, what do you think is the most, like the paper or research that you're most proud of, or where you think that you've had the most contribution?
Let's see. I like this paper that Brad mentioned about Out of the Outhouse.
Yeah.
I mean, it's nicely done. It's got a pretty sharp identification, and I also this infant health paper that I talked about, I think that's a very good paper.
Yeah.
And one that I honestly feel is underplaced, but it's okay. It's published and it will be read, and that's great.
It has real policy implications directly from the papers.
Yeah.
Oftentimes we read papers that are maybe placed in really good journals, but then it doesn't have a direct real world link.
Yep. And I think an earlier paper that I can speak to that I'm pretty proud of, and again think is underplaced, is one of the first papers that Brad and I wrote on participation in physical activity. And the reason why I think that is nice work is because there actually is a theoretical model in that paper that derives testable predictions and bring some results to the literature that had not been thought about before. Like, for example, something as simple as dealing with participation in physical activity as a two-part problem, right? You have to decide to participate, and then conditional on participating, how long are you going to do it? And different demographic characteristics influence those two different decisions differently. For example, women are are more likely to participate, but spend less time than men.
Conditional on participation.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And
I think
that has policy
it does.
implications.
Yeah.
So I think the paper that I'm most proud of, and I think has made a big impact on sports economics, is a sports economics paper of mine. So there's this very long-held idea in sports economics called the uncertainty of outcome hypothesis.
Okay.
And it's pretty simple. It's the idea that fans prefer to watch games that they think will have an uncertain outcome, so that would shift demand. And that idea was articulated in one of the first papers ever published in sports economics back in the 1950s.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And it became an sort of an article of faith that this obviously describes reality. And it turns out that nobody ever actually bothered to write down a model that would generate predictions that match that. And the predictions are clear, right? Attendance should be higher at games where the outcome is less certain. And you can figure out that, and people have for years with betting market data, right? Yeah. Point spreads and odds will tell you that is a market-based expectation of the outcome of a game, right?
Yeah.
But nobody ever wrote the model down, and so I had a paper where we actually, two co-authors and I, developed a consumer choice model, a discrete consumer choice model that would incorporate outcome uncertainty into it. And I think the interesting thing about it is it's actually a behavioral economics paper, because it turns out you can't explain the uncertainty of outcome hypothesis without building loss aversion into the model.
That's interesting.
Yeah. And if a standard model of consumer choice that wouldn't include those behavioral aspects, you can't generate the prediction that fans want to attend games with uncertain outcomes. So it's also been quite controversial because a lot of sports economists are not very accepting of behavioral economic ideas. Like in particular, there's a model that has reference dependence in the consumer utility function, and neoclassical economists hate that. Right? Those preferences are unvarying. Right?
Yeah.
They never change.
Yeah.
And they didn't also like the idea that in order to explain one of their deeply held beliefs, you had to use behavioral economics to do it.
Okay.
I got. Let's just say the reception of that paper in the discipline has not been uniformly positive.
Interesting. Well, that's fascinating. So related then, so some of the, I guess, social media buzz around the expansion of the college football playoff was, we need to expand it more, or by expanding it because of the games were not that close, right? And so do you see that the hypothesis or the argument that fans prefer the close games still has kind of these implications?
It does, right? Yeah. And I think that one of the reasons that people were so critical of the expansion of the college football playoff was that the games were really lopsided in the first round. And or it also applies to, for example, why is why are the first rounds of March Madness so unbelievably popular? And that's because, well, that's where you get the chance to see David beat Goliath, right? And that's sort of the flip side of this uncertainty of outcome hypothesis, right? There were no big upsets in the college football playoffs, but everybody wants to watch the 16 seed beat the 1 seed,
you
right?
do. Yep.
Where UMBC is one of those famous cases where I've worked for quite some time. They beat a 1 seed, Virginia.
Oh, that's right. That was UMBC. Yeah, that is a really interesting kind of flip on that, where you do want to see the underdog. You want to see that upset, but the uncertainty of that is very low.
That's right.
Yeah. That's really
Yeah, so that's the problem that my paper pointed out
Okay.
with the uncertainty of outcome hypothesis is, you can only have David beat Goliath if there's a really dominant team who is Goliath that David can beat. Yeah, so it definitely informs, and I think that probably in deciding whether they will continue to expand that playoff, they will be taking that into account, I'm sure.
Yeah. Well, it's going to be really interesting how it's going to play out.
Yeah, some of the arguments too there is that the seeding just wasn't correct.
Yeah. I mean,
Right. And
there's the expert bias or whatever that they just didn't know.
But whether or not it expands further, I think another what we learned from the first time of this is that took its toll on the players, and those 8 teams or so that were 12 teams that were continuing to play well after everyone else has stopped. It'll be interesting to see going forward if that has some impact on those teams' performance in the future, because their players are maybe a little bit more tired than
I think that there was, and injuries.
Yeah.
I think it was with Notre Dame, in one of their games, the players had been taking finals that day.
Yeah.
So they don't even remember that they are a student, right? And these are the times in which we're taking final exams, and so there are other implications from that in terms of
Absolutely.
just the physical, the mental, and
Well, but it also goes on in the NFL because there's been continual tension there where the league wants to expand the schedule, and the players are adamantly against it because of the wear and tear that it puts on their bodies. And they did add a 17th game to the regular season, and now the league is pushing for an 18th because they want to maximize revenues. But there's a principal agent problem there, right? And they're not having the best interest of the players in mind, who definitely did not want to play additional games.
Okay, so before we wrap up, I'm going to ask each of you what is the paper that you wish you have written, or if you had more time, this is what you would do. So what's the one area or topic, or if there's a specific paper that you're still just dying to write or want somebody to write?
I think for me, it's pretty easy.
Okay.
Going back to health and health behaviors, I think that we can't get a good handle on how to address the obesity problem because we do not have a good understanding of the intersection of nutrition and physical activity. And I think until we can, so I'm really interested in going down what could be a rabbit hole, because I think that combination, that intersection is really, really important in understanding the propensity to be obese, and also to understand the heterogeneity across people. And that work has not really been done at all.
Yeah.
Not in economics. There certainly in health services research, there would be studies about nutrition and that, but not in economics, and not in a way where we can bring our tools of causal inference and try and understand the behavioral aspects and identify mechanism and test for them. I think that having a better understanding of how those two things interact on an individual person would help us to understand a lot more about the problem.
That's fascinating. Brad?
Yeah, so it's actually I got scoop story that I have in mind here.
Okay.
There's this really amazingly detailed data set on taxi trips in New York City, and I mean you know the start and end of every taxi trip, how long it took, and how much they paid and how much they tipped.
Okay.
Okay. So I've been interested for some time in the impact of emotional cues on economic behavior.
Okay.
There's this famous paper by David Card, Nobel laureate, that shows that that domestic violence incidents go up in cities home to NFL teams after upset losses. Yeah, it's an amazing paper. And so one of the things about that literature that had not been demonstrated was if emotional cues have any impact on any economic outcome, because it's really hard to match up. Right, crime is really easy to match up, right? So I looked at this taxi data, and there were a lot of people in the economics department, not a lot, but 4 or 5 graduate students, some faculty who were working with that taxi data, which is really a large data set that takes a lot of cleaning, and you have to know what you're doing to work with it.
Okay.
And so I pitched this idea to a colleague of mine who will remain nameless that, here's a great emotional cue paper. Figure out when there's upset losses in Madison Square Garden by the Knicks or the Rangers, and see if that affects tipping for those taxi rides. And there's millions of records in that data set. If it affects tipping, he was like, "Nah, that's not interesting. Here's my idea. I want to look at taxi rides that start on Wall Street on the day that when the market goes down a whole bunch, and see if people get in taxis there." Well, that didn't turn out, and no result was gotten, and I was still saying, let's work on this, let's work on this. And then I go to a conference, and there's that paper.
No.
Yeah, there it is. It's exactly that paper.
That is amazing and awful, but yes, right? That's just...
Yeah, and it found
and I'm assuming the result, that you expected.
Well, upset wins. Basically, it's hard to find anything that explains lower tips. But after unexpected upset wins, people tip more.
Yeah, everybody's happy in a good mood.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Makes total sense. Well, I have seen some stuff in like behavioral finance where they'll link trading behavior to a variety of events and things like that. So it's very similar to what you're describing. Yeah.
Yeah, in behavioral finance, I know there's a literature that looks at what happens to national stock exchange performance after the national team wins the World Cup.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And it goes up.
It goes, I was going to say, it goes up. Everybody's happy and buy more. So, yeah. Well, thank you guys so much for joining me today. And this is the Probasco podcast, and I appreciate your guys' time.
Thank you.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it.